All right, we are at 2 o'clock. Good afternoon. Welcome to the May Reliability and Security Oversight Monthly Update. My name is Maylee Cook, and I am a Training and Outreach Specialist here at WECC. Let's start with a few announcements. To begin with, we have our reliability risk priorities. The staff recommendation has been published. Our staff have recommended 5 risks for approval. And if you would like to check out what those risks are, we will drop the link to that document in the chat. Also coming up, we have our June Reliability in the West discussion series. This will be on June 5th from 11 a.m. until noon. The topic next month is the NERC Summer Assessment. We hope to see you there. This summer and going into fall, we are hosting some enforcement fundamental courses. We have multiple locations across the Western Interconnection for you to take this course to be introduced to enforcement fundamentals. Those classes are starting to fill up, so if you were thinking about coming, I would recommend checking those out and registering soon to reserve your spot. On June 11th and 12th, WECC will be hosting its Board of Directors and associated meetings. These will be offered in a hybrid format, so you may attend virtually or in person. And our technical session this time around will be on the effects of Winter Storm Jerry and Winter Storm Heather on the Western Interconnection. So go ahead and get those on your calendar, save those. You can register through the link we provide in the chat. That's it for announcements, so we'll go on to our antitrust policy. All WECC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WECC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with the policy and guidelines. This meeting is public. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in open session. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WECC strives to ensure the information presented today is accurate and reflects the views of WECC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have any questions, please contact WECC's legal counsel. We do encourage your participation in this meeting. If you have questions for either of our presenters, feel free to send those via the chat feature to WECC meetings. You may also use the raise your hand feature, and we will allow you to unmute and ask your question verbally. On the agenda today, we have an update on PRC 6 given by Tyson, and then we will have internal compliance program and internal controls by Molly Elliott. We'll turn the time over to Tyson. Go ahead, Tyson. Are you?
Yep. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. You're very faint, but I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Yep. Go ahead. Next slide. So as most of you are aware, the PRC6 form goes out annually. So the GO's response is due June 1st. TOTOP response is due July 1st. The biggest change that we had this year was if you said that it was not applicable to you in 2023, then you will not have received a data request from WECC. And at this point, if you feel like you should, then please reach out to Deja and she can send that. But the reason you didn't is because you said it was not applicable to you the prior year. And that's how we're going to do that going forward. And so this year, if you say, hey, it's not applicable, then you will not receive the request in 2025. And we do ask that you use the current 2024 attachment A form. We add new data in. There's a lot of data checks that are in place with that form. I know it's locked down really tight, and I know that can be frustrating. But for the most part, the additional notes and things like that aren't usually used. If there is something that you feel is very important, please feel free to reach out and give me an email. But we just received so many data requests that we can't unlock these because a lot of people are, adding cells, columns, rows, and then when we do this data checking, it kind of breaks a lot of the things that we do in the background. And so we have locked this form down a lot, but you do need to use the 2024 attachment A form. Otherwise, we will be sending it back to you, requesting you use the latest form. Is there any questions or concerns with this?
Thanks so much for that update. Let me check and see if we got any questions for you. I did drop the link to attachment A in the chat for folks. The first one, there was a funny space, so I do apologize. Use the second link, that's the complete one. I am not seeing any questions for you, Tyson. Thanks for being here with us to give us this update.
Of course.
All right. We'll now turn the time over to Molly Elliott to give her presentation on internal compliance programs and internal controls.
Thank you, Maylee. Good afternoon. My name is Molly Elliott. I'm a senior technical analyst here at WECC with a focus on internal controls. Next slide, please. I'd like to take some time today to walk through guidance on internal compliance programs and address how they overlap and how they're different from internal controls programs. Next slide. In 2005, FERC came out with 13 questions to determine if an entity had an internal compliance program sufficient to mitigate penalties. Most of our entities have used these questions to either design or update their program. And while we call it the 13 questions, they were originally grouped into 5 sections. So the first was to establish a formal program. The second, that formal program needed to be supported appropriately by senior management. Third, that it was consistently reviewed, updated, and trained. Fourth, there was an expectation of monitoring through internal audits. And fifth was response to wrongdoing. Now, this response, when a compliance is non-discovered, when a non-compliance is discovered, there's an expectation of some form of investigation, remediation, consequences for the employees involved, etc. But they're also looking for your ability to prevent future occurrences of non-compliance. And this is where internal controls were first included in an internal compliance program. They were preventative controls and instituted reactively, not proactively. Next slide. About 5 years later, FERC issued 7 factors. These were parallel, but they added a few additional elements. First, overall, the organization is expected to prevent and detect violations. So here's where we see a proactive compliance-related internal control program. We still see the requirement for authority and resourcing, but now it explicitly adds an ethics angle to that. It says specifically that those with authority shall not have engaged in conduct inconsistent with an effective program. And they also add safe reporting of potential violations, which would be hotlines or other confidential mechanisms. A less discussed follow-up section, there's a section, subsection C, says that in implementing these 7 factors, the organization shall periodically assess the risk of violations and shall take appropriate steps to design, implement, or modify each requirement set forth in subsection B. So this is where we're first seeing the concept of risk assessments into the compliance plan context. Next slide. So 10 years later, the Department of Justice published guidelines that have since been updated in 2023. There are 3 questions that the Department of Justice asks, and this comes up to be very similar to what we were looking at before from FERC, but they're a lot more detailed, and they're not specific, of course, to the energy or utility industry. They do provide a significantly improved framework, though. So the first question is the corporation's compliance program well designed? And they are looking here for a risk assessment. Now, we're not getting away from compliance here. but the Department of Justice wants to know whether the program is appropriately designed to detect and prevent the particular types of misconduct most likely to occur in a particular corporation's line of business, and with regard to the particular regulatory environment for that corporation. So one example here is putting more scrutiny on those larger transactions that are more likely to risk non-compliance. And one of those would be mergers and acquisitions, which we specifically see called out here, and another might be that third-party management. This is particularly timely for our industry with the rate at which assets are bought and sold, and the number of third parties that are brought in to perform compliance duties. And a strong internal compliance program should have consideration for these items. Next slide. Now, the last two questions look very, very similar to what we've seen before. Is the corporation's compliance program adequately resourced and empowered to function effectively? And does the corporation's compliance program work in practice? I do recommend that you go ahead and look up that DOJ document. There is a lot more detail around this than in the original FERC documents. It has some great examples and expands on many of the themes, but it does sound an awful lot like the original FERC themes of commitment by senior management, autonomy and resources, and so forth. But for example, in the continuous improvement periodic testing and review section, the DOJ document talks more specifically about what an internal audit should look like, and that would include control testing. There's also an expectation of updates to risk assessments, leading to updates to policies and procedures and other practices, and an application of gap analysis. So you can see just how much more detailed and stronger emphasis on controls and risk than what we've had in the past that comes out in this DOJ document. This, I think, has led to some of the confusion between what we talk about when we talk about an internal controls program and an internal compliance program. So next slide, please. So now I want to talk some about internal controls programs specifically and their frameworks. Before I jump into the COSO framework, I did want to point out that the purpose of this talk today is a little different from what we've talked about in the past. So we had Michelson Buchanan here from NERC in November talking about the Aero Enterprise approach to reviewing internal controls. We had Gary Nolan from APS talk to us in March of 23 about how they built their internal controls program. I recommend you go back and look at these if you missed them. Those presentations are still available on the WECC calendar. But today I'm really going to look at this from an ideal COSO framework model, as that's really the most recognized today. But we're not talking about how WECC is analyzing your controls program as much as we're talking about the theory behind and an understanding of what a controls program would look like in an ideal situation. Next slide, please. So the COSO model presents us with the well-known cube, which can look a bit academic at first, but the important thing to keep in mind here is that it emphasizes that controls and activities are happening in various parts of your organization, and that you're fulfilling various organizational objectives. So the 5 components are control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. And they occur across 3 categories of objectives: operations, reporting, and compliance, and at 4 distinct levels of the corporation, which are defined as entity, division, operating unit, and function. So keep in mind that a mature program should be addressing all of the 5 components in each of the intersections there. So many of our entities focus really pretty much solely on this compliance objective slice, or at least that's the piece that we're seeing, right? And they're including their controls program within the compliance program documentation. And this would be very consistent with the Department of Justice compliance program guidance, as it would include controls inside of a compliance program. And this approach is probably going to work pretty well for a smaller entity, but a more complex or a higher risk entity is really going to find that an integrated program that includes operations and reporting objectives will make more sense for them. Many times also, what we're seeing is internal controls program that's limited to the company or division level. As an example, we've had several companies in response to our inquiries send corporate compliance solution information back as their internal control program. So these are programs that have reminders and escalation for time-based standards, for example. They have compliance reporting capabilities. The compliance department can demonstrate evidence submissions, reviews, et cetera. And they're really good controls, but they're limited to that space of just the compliance department, which may be at the entity or division level controls. And it doesn't really even meet the full intent of the internal compliance program, because the Department of Justice document makes it really clear that controls that support compliance should be found, and they are found, at multiple levels of the corporation. And should be managed as such. It should be managed throughout the organization. And this is a more layered approach to mitigating compliance risk. Next slide. So I do want to start by saying that every organization has controls in place. So you're going to have controls at every layer of your organization, even if there's no documented formal internal controls program. When our audit team goes out and looks at controls during the audit, they never come back and say they found 0 controls. That just doesn't happen. But what we're talking about today and addressing today is what makes an effective internal controls program and how that differs from an internal compliance program. So I just want you to keep in mind that I'm addressing a programmatic approach. And to do so, an entity needs to implement all 5 components across all 5 levels and all 3 categories of controls. As a side note, I do not mean to imply either that WECC is going to go look at every control in your organization when we're there on audit. I'm describing how the program should function, not what we're going to assess. So when we go on site, we are primarily looking at compliance and some operational controls that relate to that, but more on that later. So each of the 5 components in the COSO structure, there are 17 total principles that should be applied throughout the organization. And I'd like to go ahead and walk through some of those. Next slide, please. So the first one I want to look at here is controls environment. What I've done here on these slides is we're going to walk through each of the 5 components and their accompanying principles. And you're going to see that in many ways, they look like a strong internal compliance program. The control program is on the right, and the compliance program is on the left. Pulled some elements out of the DOJ or the FERC 13 questions documents. But remember that the primary difference here actually is the objective category. So if you're focused only on the compliance objectives, particularly compliance controls at the entity level, you're supporting a compliance program, but you're missing a lot of the elements of that mature controls program. But again, so starting with the control environment, these look very similar. There are a lot of common themes: level of commitment, integrity, and tone at the top come through in both programs. They're very important to both programs. What management's committed to here may be the key difference, right? Because the compliance program is going to take a little more limited view of that risk, while the controls program looks at a wider swath. And this is going to naturally lead to different structures of responsibilities and incentive structures between the 2 programs, even though they'll overlap. significantly. Next slide. So risk assessment. The COSO controls framework is significantly more detailed than what's expected of a risk assessment, even though they exist in both areas. That's because the risk assessment really is the key to a strong controls program. The compliance program will often have a zero non-compliance as a goal. Whereas in the controls program, the risk assessment is going to typically incorporate concepts like risk tolerance, measurement of risk, monitoring for emerging risk, responding to changes that can affect risk, and so forth. Now, in a compliance program, you still have to allocate resources. So you will have a risk assessment in the compliance program. It will be based on your individual risk of violating specific standards. And you'll want to put more resources towards those that are more likely to be violated. Also, many WECC entities are going a step beyond and looking at either violation severity levels or some other proxy for the impact of violating that standard. So most of our entities are going a step beyond just whether or not the standard is likely to be violated. Next slide, please. So control activities. This is the crux, if you will, of the program. So when we say we're going on site to look at your controls, what we're really talking about when we're looking at controls related as part of the audit is your control activities, right? The first principle of control activities is that they're designed specifically to mitigate risk. This is what I was saying before. You have to identify your risk in order to design your controls or your control activities. Additionally, the COSO framework expects controls to be designed at the appropriate level of the organizational structure. That gets into, doing the work, closer to the operational control is actually, at the SME level is where you're likely to get the biggest bang for your buck. Control activities can be automated or manual. Procedural controls will be manual. You should select the controls that are most effective at the appropriate level using the appropriate technologies or manual tools. And of course, all of these would be true of compliance controls as well. Next slide, please. Information and communication. Both programs will have elements of information and communication. The COSO model goes into a little more depth. They speak specifically to external communication, to gathering data and using that data appropriately throughout the organization. Any kind of analysis and communication that needs to happen to effectively support this process. And this is the information management piece of the puzzle. I've seen this done very well in one internal compliance program where there were a lot of sophisticated dashboards to keep employees at all levels of the organization aware of compliance status, lessons learned, action plans, and so forth. But it's not common among our WECC entities to have that level of sophistication in the compliance program. Next slide, please. Monitoring. Obviously, monitoring and continuous improvement are very important aspects of both a compliance program and a controls program. In order to monitor controls, the entity, of course, needs to understand what controls they have. A lot of our entities have been working really hard to catalog controls, establish baselines. That can take quite a while, but we actually have a number of entities that are pretty far along in that process, and I'm pretty excited to see that because once the baseline is established, the entity can conduct regular reviews of those controls for effectiveness. When deficiencies are discovered, controls should be updated. In some cases, this would be compliance violations. The compliance program, of course, will focus mostly on that. And those should be self-reported, remediated, and new reactive controls put in place to prevent future recurrence. In other cases on the control side, you may find that it's not an issue of compliance. It's not an actual violation. You could have had a near miss, but you also just could have had a process that wasn't followed, and you might want to analyze that to determine how the process was circumvented, and whether there are appropriate controls to put in place or to enhance those controls. The entity should set up a formal process to update controls based on these lessons learned. It's obviously not enough to just identify lessons learned, but to have an action plan coming out of this is important. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've walked through the 5 components. We've seen actually that a lot of the concepts are very similar between the two, and it's really a difference in focus. In a compliance program, it's actually easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. It's kind of like looking through binoculars. You have an excellent view, but you've limited your field of vision, and you often don't see what else is around, and that includes operational risks. So in this photo, you're looking at the bird. You can't see if there are predators in the periphery. But now turning back to NERC standards, NERC standards are focused on operational risks. And this is, again, I think there's a lot of confusion between what's internal compliance and what's internal controls. And there's a lot of overlap, because with a standard that's focused on operational risk, compliance controls and compliance programs will naturally include risk mitigation that includes an operational risk focus. So this is a lot less clear than if you were looking purely at, say, reporting objectives for accounting standards. Those are perhaps a lot more clear cut than the NERC standards, which are actually already operationally focused. So a lot of your compliance program work incorporates internal control, including operational controls. An example, if you will, of a compliance control that also functions as an operational control might be, let's say, an inventory system or an account authorization system. They provide technical controls for compliance with standards like PRC 5 or SIP 4. But there's that natural bridge to operations and reporting as well. And these systems are highly unlikely to focus solely on compliance. They really shouldn't. As compliance professionals, that may be your primary interest in them, but your SMEs are looking at compliance as a byproduct of the operations of their daily jobs. And these controls are implemented at the functional level, and they often reflect that. It can be easy to focus on the exact wording of the standard, but we also need to look at this from a controls program perspective, so that we can focus on the purpose of the standard and the mitigation of that risk. So I'm going to go with a completely non-NERC example now. If you want to move to the next slide, Maylee. Okay, traffic controls and regulations. We're all familiar with speed limits. A speed limit is a regulation that you as an individual must comply with. You can be pulled over, you can be given a speeding ticket, so there are fines associated with it. If you're focused on the compliance with that speed limit, there are controls that you're going to want to implement. You're going to monitor for violations yourself using a speedometer. When I'm on a long road trip in West Texas, I also use my cruise control as a preventative control. I want to make sure I'm not going to get pulled over when I get distracted on those long, boring drives. You also may have some more sophisticated controls. The insurance companies now have recorders that they can put in your car that have behavioral reports that come out. This could be a deterrent to speeding, could be considered deterrent control because you probably are getting a better rate on your car insurance if you are sticking to the speed limit. And the recorder is also an element that provides feedback for improvement from the insurance company. Next slide, please. But let's take a look at this from the internal controls standpoint, shall we say, where we start by identifying the underlying risk. Why has the government decided to put a regulation for a speed limit? Let's look at a couple examples. So it could be the risk of crashes due to not having enough time to stop, or not having or not being able to maintain control of the vehicle. So let's look at the question of not having enough time to stop. There are other controls that could be implemented to mitigate this risk, even if those specific actions are not enforceable through regulation, right? So the speed limit's the regulation, but the problem could very well be tailgating as well. It's really hard to measure, monitor, enforce anti-tailgating regulations, but we do have controls, and some of those controls are the same as my compliance controls. So the same insurance company tracking device can also look at hard acceleration, braking, and other potential behaviors that could be signs of tailgating. So you're going to be getting those same incentives for not accelerating quickly or braking quickly. You'll be getting that same feedback from the same control. Another possibility is that your cruise control, like the cruise control on my husband's car, may have maybe radar equipped. And I found that slows me down if there's traffic in front of me and keeps me at a safe distance. And my daughter commented that I left a lot more space than any of the other cars around me when I use that. Both of these controls are meant to meet compliance with the speed limit, but they also provide additional controls that mitigate the risk of not having enough stopping distance, and therefore are more secure. The other risk that we were talking about was the loss of control of the vehicle. These are not directly mitigated by those compliance controls we just went through, but there are other controls that are unrelated to speed limit that might mitigate the risk of loss of control of the vehicle. Things like anti-lock braking systems for rain or ice, or putting on snow tires in the winter, or electronic stability control for curves. These are unrelated entirely with compliance with the speed limit, but they address one of the same risks that the speed limit is designed to mitigate, and are, of course, advisable depending on the conditions to have those. Next slide, please. So what can the compliance team do? This is a question I get frequently from entities. How can compliance personnel influence operational personnel when they're maybe in different divisions? They don't really directly report to them other than in a strict compliance capacity. So some entities are blending internal compliance with internal controls, and some are keeping it separate. And that's really a choice that your entity can make. But if you do have an entity level risk management program in your company, I would say be sure that you integrate your compliance risk management work into the overall program. Make sure that you're working hand in hand with the rest of the organization. If you don't have an entity risk management program in your organization because you're a much smaller entity, just be sure that you're focusing on the intent of the standard in addition to the risk of falling out of compliance. While operational personnel don't necessarily report to the compliance team, the compliance team can be instrumental in communications and outreach to support SME controls implementation. They can provide frameworks for designing controls. They can help with implementing and testing controls. They can provide outreach on the best way to document controls. They can provide databases and other tools for their SMEs to maintain those controls. Finally, compliance organizations are typically part of a plan to monitor for compliance violations within the organization. These internal audits can easily be expanded and be an excellent opportunity to review control design and control of effectiveness at the same time as you are reviewing compliance with the standard. And you can provide recommendations back to the business unit at that point in time. The best programs we've seen also have a formal feedback structure that allows for meetings between internal audit and the business unit to develop a course of action, to formalize a plan, and to track implementation of enhancements or implementation of new controls. Next slide, please. So takeaways. I hope this presentation has cleared up some of the terminology used around internal controls and internal compliance programs. They are very related concepts, and we want to make sure that we say what we mean, right? The guidance for internal compliance programs has progressively included internal controls, but how you structure these programs is up to you. Internal compliance programs, of course, are going to have controls, preventative controls, but now we're also looking at risk-based controls of all types within compliance programs. But a mature internal compliance program goes beyond compliance risk. So the COSO model calls out that there's specifically 3 categories of objectives: reporting, operating, and compliance. And your internal compliance program is going to focus on the last category, but your entity-wide program should be focused on all 3. Also, make sure your controls don't focus solely on compliance organization controls, but also include all your process SMEs in those controls. Finally, don't forget to address the purpose of the standard and your control objectives. Focus on the risk that your organization might fall out of compliance, but also focus on the risk that your organization might not meet the operational risk objective. Next slide, please. So I've just included these helpful references here, these links to the documents that I referenced earlier in the presentation. The standards for internal control in the federal government is also known as the Green Book, and goes into a lot of information about how to structure and how to assess an internal controls program, and is based on that COSO model. And then the U.S. Department of Justice Criminal Division Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs is that more detailed corporate compliance program framework that I referenced. And now I guess I am ready to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Molly. We did actually get some asks for those documents, so pleased to see that they were in there. We'll also drop the links for folks in the chat right here as well for quick access, but the slides are posted with those links as well. And let's see, there is a clarifying question about, is WECC going to use the DOJ materials to evaluate internal compliance programs going forward?
So I was afraid I would get that question. I don't believe at this point in time we are incorporating that level of detail into our evaluation of internal compliance programs. I don't believe we're going to that level. The majority of what we're doing in terms of evaluating internal compliance programs right now is in the enforcement group during the penalty assessment calculation. And I don't believe that that level of detail has been incorporated into that program, though these may be concepts that are considered when looking at self-logging capabilities.
Great. That makes sense. I am not seeing another question in my box, but we'll give it just a second and make sure there are no hands raised. I knew as I said that one would come in. From Eric, it says, great presentation. Any tips for entities on how they can test whether existing controls are effective?
That sounds to me like a whole other presentation. Thank you, Eric, for that question. So there are several things going into how you test if a control is effective. So obviously there is past performance is part of that, right? But what you are looking at is things like human element. How easy is it to get around the control? I guess obviously the first question is, does it actually meet the risk objective? Because you can define controls that are not well designed to meet the risk objective, and that would of course not be effective in that case. But most of this is going to probably work best through your internal audit process when you are looking at how the controls work in the real world. So you can design them, and until you see how they work in the real world, it's just not clear how effective it will be.
Thank you. We have a question that I'll kind of phrase as a comment that it says, Molly, you mentioned you saw one entity do this really well with sophisticated dashboards, lessons learned, and so on. Do you think they would be willing to present on their program? So we've got a proposal for a future
I can ask
presentation.
them.
Yeah.
This is specific to an internal compliance program, not an internal controls program. But yes, I can ask them if they would be willing to present. But
Yeah, that's great feedback to know that that's what you're interested in. I am not seeing any other questions at this time. So thank you so much for the couple we received, and thank you, Molly, and also Tyson, for your presentations today. I have one final announcement for you guys that I forgot at the beginning. Our Oversight Trends Report is available on WECC.org, and that is a report we put out quarterly for you to check out and see what's happening in the Western Interconnection. I'll drop the link in the chat. We'll also have, we'll update the slides to include that as well. If you would go to the next slide, I think we have a visual to go with that. If not, we'll move to our next slide, which is the June 20th meeting. We look forward to seeing you here next month on the third Thursday at 2 p.m. And have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today.